And now it's my pleasure to introduce to you Dominik Markel, who is professor for Old Testament studies at the University of Innsbruck. His main research foci are the Pentateuch, the religious history of Israel, the history of political ideas, and in connection with it, the history of mass violence. So please welcome Dominik Markel, ladies and gentlemen.
So many thanks to Robert, Rahim, Astrid, Clemens, everybody behind the scenes. I'm learning extremely much from this interdisciplinary wealth of this conference. A handout is going around. I hope everybody is getting it. Ladies and gentlemen, Michael Jursa called the period from the beginning of the Neo-Babylonian period to Darius I the long 6th century, in light of its continuity in terms of administration and economy. In terms of political theologies, in contrast, the transition from Neo-Babylonian to Persian rule, from Nabonidus to Darius I, especially the 3 decades from 550 to 520 BCE, was a period of turmoil and intense development that, as I shall argue, had effects on the transformation of imperial ideologies of world historical significance. I shall proceed in 3 steps. First, I will outline some key moments of the transformation of political theologies from the late Neo-Babylonian to the early Persian Empire. Second, I will argue that these transformations form a decisive background for the development of Judean Monotheism, as it is reflected in some texts of the Hebrew Bible. And third, I shall argue that these developments had longue durée effects on the transformation of imperial ideologies, and thanks to Miguel John Versluis for introducing the topic of the axial age. I'm turning to my first point: transformations of imperial theologies from Nabonidus to Darius I. Nabonidus' attempt at elevating Sin as the head of the pantheon is seen especially in his late inscriptions from Ur and Haran. As Paul-Alain Beaulieu argued, it seems that Nabonidus was planning to restore Sin's main temples at Haran and Ur already during his early years. The inscriptions from the Tema period, however, are quite traditional in their acknowledgement of Marduk's supreme authority. Most likely, they reflect the politics of Belshazzar, Nabonidus' son and administrator in charge in Babylon. When Nabonidus returned, however, he invested great energy into the restoration of Sin's temples in Haran and Ur, accompanied by propaganda that proclaims Sin head of the pantheon. 4 monumental inscriptions have been preserved in Haran from this period, 2 texts in 2 copies each. The Haran stele that commemorates the restoration of the Ehulhul and the Arad Kupi stele. 3 of these stele were found in the pavement of the great mosque of Haran from the Umayyad period: the Arad Kupi stele, copy 1 of the Haran stele with its base, and copy 2 of the same inscription, the slab in a secondary use as a threshold of the west entrance. Besides the monumental inscriptions from Haran, an important inscription for Nabonidus' theology of Sin is a cylinder inscription from Ur that commemorates the restoration of the ziggurat of the Sin temple, Elugal Margasisa. 11 copies of this inscription were found at the ziggurat of Ur, 3 of which are seen here. It is specifically the epithets used for Sin that demonstrate his exaltation to supremacy in the pantheon, as Beaulieu showed in his analysis. In this table, I have listed the epithets used in the Haran stele and in the Elugal Margasisa cylinder. Several epithets that express supremacy in the pantheon are applied to Sin. Baal Ilani, Shar Ilani, Baal Beleh, Enlil Ilani, Shar Sharani, which are very common. Much less common is the last epithet applied to Sin in each text. In a climactic culmination of praise, Sin is called Ilu Shailani, God of gods. As Beaulieu put it, this is probably, I quote, the highest epithet ever given to a god in the Mesopotamian tradition, unquote. While the expression God of gods in the Elugal Magasisa cylinder had been recognized for a long time, Chaudik recognized it in the Haran stele as well. Lord of lords and King of kings are standard royal and divine epithets in the ancient Near East. Given the frequency of these formulations, one might expect that God of gods was a standard expression as well. This, however, does not seem to be the case. As far as I can see, in the Mesopotamian corpus, there are 3 texts that apply the female version of this title, Ilat Ilati, to female deities, namely to Ishtar, Damkina, and to Tashmetu. And we have but one single tablet before Nabonidus that employs the title Ilu Shailani with reference to Marduk. Namely, in the priestly prayer on tablet K2962, for Roland 29 from Ashurbanipal's library. Werner Meyer kindly helped me to identify the relevant lines 15 to 16. I shall come back to this expression in a bit. Nabonidus' attempt at transforming Babylonian imperial theology was highly unpopular in Babylon itself. When Persian troops entered Babylon on the 12th October 539, and in the following days, King Nabonidus of Babylonia surrendered to King Cyrus of Persia, the military conquest had not been hard to achieve, but the political war of propaganda continued. Thus we read in the Cyrus cylinder that it was Marduk who had ordered Cyrus to march to Babylon, and it was Marduk who delivered into Cyrus's hands Nabonidus, I quote, the king who did not worship him, unquote. A programmatic pamphlet against Nabonidus has come down to us in the verse account that ridicules Nabonidus' attempt at making Sin the head of the pantheon, and it is most likely based on direct knowledge of Nabonidus' own propagandistic inscriptions. Until recently, one might have assumed that Cyrus's adoption of Marduk theology was a merely opportunistic appropriation of Babylonian imperial ideology, solely aimed at convincing the Babylonian elite to collaborate in his imperial project. However, the discovery of a monumental structure inspired by Babylon's Ishtar Gate, measuring 29 per 22 meters at Tol Ajori, 3.5 kilometers west of the Persepolis Terrace, has shed new light on the transferal of Babylonian imperial ideology to the Persian heartland. The excavation is directed by Alireza Ascari Javerdi of Shiraz University and Pier Francesco Caglieri of Bologna. And my images here are from Caglieri's article, Ideological Aspects of Persian Art and Architecture as Seen from Persepolis in a Historical Perspective, from the conference volume Stones, Tablets and Scrolls. Both the architecture and the iconography of this building have close parallels with the Ishtar Gate. Some of the glazed relief bricks excavated to date fit perfectly well into the Ishtar Gate's pictorial program. All evidence suggests that this gate, or monumental structure, dates to the very early phase of the Persian period, to the time of either Cyrus or Cambyses. Especially the use of Babylonian rather than Persian cuneiform script in the fragments of inscriptions that have come to light are telling in terms of an early date. As Caglieri states, I quote, "It is tempting to interpret the monument as a trophy ordered by Cyrus the Great to celebrate in his own homeland his outstanding conquest of Babylon in 539 BCE, unquote. Of special interest for us are the monument's implications for Persian imperial theology. it shows that a Babylonian imperial symbol was imported to the heartland of Parsa on a monumental scale. Highly relevant in this regard are the depictions of Mushkushu in the gate structure. The motif occurs in seals of Neo-Babylonian style on some of the earliest inscribed tablets found in the Persepolis fortifications archive, but then never again in the art of the Achaemenid period. Again, I quote Cagliari, "A probable reason for the absence of the Mushkushu lies in the nature of the snake, which is an evil creature in Mazdean culture. Therefore, even without entering into the complex question of the religion of the Achaemenid kings, the Mushkushu seems incompatible with their affiliation with Ahuramazda, which Darius proclaimed in the first inscription at Bizitun," unquote. This brings us to the next major phase of transformation in Achaemenid imperial theology, the Ahuramazda theology as imperial theology introduced by Darius. The Bizitun inscription stands out as Darius' first monumental inscription project that involves the introduction of the Persian cuneiform script, developed, as it seems, for this monumental project, an imperial ideology firmly based on Ahuramazda theology, and a multimedia effort of distributing its message to every corner of the empire, which is not only claimed in the inscription itself, but still seen in copies preserved from Babylon and even a 5th century BCE Aramaic copy from Elephantine. And I'm grateful to Karen for having mentioned the special role of Esagila with his succession treaty that was maybe a first effort in mass media distribution in the ancient Near East, and I would be happy to discuss how this may relate to Darius' efforts. In view of my later discussion of Judean monotheism, I should mention here that Darius' theology firmly concentrates on Ahuramazda as his imperial protector deity, but at the same time emphatically states the existence and support by the other gods who are. If indeed the Ishtar gate-like structure of Tole Ajori was destroyed quite soon after its construction, as Cagliari assumes, and Gian Pietro Basello just confirmed kindly that this assumption is solely based for the moment on the absence of Persian imperial script, and Ali Musavi, I fear, is not quite convinced. But if it is the case, it is tempting to ask whether it was destroyed for ideological reasons in the context of Darius' transformation of imperial theology towards Ahuramazda theology. I'm curious to see what further archaeological investigation at the site will yield. In sum, we can see 3 steps of major transformations of imperial theology between 550 and 520. First, Nabonidus' attempt at inner imperial transformation of theology, which second facilitated Persian imperial takeover under Cyrus with the restoration of Marduk theology that was even imported to the Persian heartland. And third, Darius' implementation of Ahuramazda theology in monumental and multimedia propaganda. In my second point, I shall briefly argue that the 3 steps of transformations of imperial theologies in the transition from the Neo-Babylonian to the early Achaemenid Empire are reflected in some key texts of the Hebrew Bible that show the emergence of Judean monotheism in its strict sense, that is, the denial of the existence of other gods besides Yahweh Elohim, the God of Israel. I presuppose that tendencies towards the monolatry of Yahweh may have developed for the official temple cult in Jerusalem in the 7th century, but the explicit denial of the existence of other gods, especially in Deutero-Isaiah and Deuteronomy 4, presupposes the destruction of Judah's traditional religion in the aftermath of 587 BCE. First, Nabonidus' attempt at elevating Sin as god of gods, Ilusha Ilani, seems to be reflected in Deuteronomy 10:17, where the struggle over the God of gods, the struggle over who the God of gods is supposed to be, Marduk or Sin, is emphatically decided in favor of Yahweh, the God of Israel. Ki Yahweh Elohechem, hu Elohe ha-Elohim va-Adonai ha-Adonim. For Yahweh, he is the God of gods and Lord of lords. Both expressions are applied to Sin in Nabonidus' inscriptions with ideological emphasis. It is unnecessary to assume that Judean theologians knew the inscriptions themselves, but it seems likely that they were familiar with the respective ideological discourse that must have been a contested matter in Babylonia during Nabonidus' temple restorations at Ur and Haran. It seems clear to me that the expressions God of gods and Lord of lords imply the idea of a pantheon, and are thus unlikely to be expressions of a monotheistic idea. But the monotheistic claims in Deuteronomy 4 seem to transform the formulation of Deuteronomy 10:16, as will be seen shortly. Second, the imperial ideology expressed in the Cyrus cylinder, with its claim that Marduk took Cyrus by his hand and led him to conquer Babylonia, is transformed to the idea that this was the work of the God of Israel in Isaiah 45. I quote, very famous text, "Thus says Yahweh to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have grasped, to subdue nations before him, and to loose the belts of kings, to open doors before him, that gates may not be closed. I will go before you and level the exalted places. I will break in pieces the doors of bronze and cut through the bars of iron. I will give you the treasures of darkness and the hoards in secret places, that you may know that it is I, Yahweh, the God of Israel, who call you by your name." This text, that clearly presupposes Cyrus's imperial theology, continues by making explicit and strong monotheistic claims. "For the sake of my servant Jacob and Israel, my chosen, I call you by your name. I name you, though you do not know me. I am Yahweh, and there is no other. Besides me, there is no God. I equip you, though you do not know me, that people may know from the rising of the sun and from the west that there is none beside me. I am Yahweh, and there is no other." You may remember that Sebastian Fink yesterday started his presentation with a quotation from Luca Sagesi with this very formulation, from the sunrise to the setting of the sun, where for the first time in the ancient Near East this spatial imagination of imperial space was created. And thank you, Sebastian, for sending the article overnight. The following chapter, Isaiah 46, explicitly proclaims the demise of Marduk and Nebo. "Baal bows down, Nebo stoops. Their idols are on beasts and livestock." This radical move may presuppose the third transformation of imperial theology, the abandonment of Babylonian theology for the sake of Ahuramazda. If this is correct, the emphatic phrase, "there is no other," Hebrew ein od, may be a negative transformation of the affirmation found in the Bizitun inscription about the other gods who are. While Darius brought Babylonian imperial theology down by replacing it by Persian Ahuramazda theology, but still affirmed the support by the other gods who are, Judean theologians may have taken Darius' example to replace both Babylonian and Persian imperial theology by the claim of the universal reign of the God of Israel, while at the same time affirming against Darius that there is no other God besides him. The same theological key idea is introduced at the culmination of Deuteronomy's introductory discourse in Deuteronomy 1-4. Ki Yahweh hu ha Elohim ein od milevado, which appears like a reduction of the phrase that applied Nabonidus' epithets foreseen to Yahweh in Deuteronomy 10. Here, the God of Israel is not anymore declared God of gods and Lord of lords, but the God, there is no other. In all brevity, I try to show, in the second point, that the three phases of transformations of imperial theologies under Nabonidus, Cyrus, and Darius are reflected in key formulations that mark the emergence of the Judean monotheistic claim. While these transformations of imperial theologies provide an important background to the development of Judean monotheism, I believe that they are not sufficient to explain the boldness of this idea. I have argued elsewhere, with the help of trauma theory, that the monotheistic claim can be understood as a belated reaction of Judeans to the Babylonian defeat and destruction of Jerusalem, encouraged by the Persian takeover of Babylonian rule. My third point, the longue durée transformation of imperial theology, can be nothing but a brief outlook at the aftermath of the developments that I tried to outline. The transformations that I have discussed happened in less than half a century, and they introduced the period of ideological stability, relative stability, in terms of imperial theology throughout Achaemenid rule. The emergence of the Judean monotheistic claim was at first not more than a strong idea within a narrow elite, within a peripheral minority, within the Persian Empire. It took centuries for it to become a claim widely accepted in Judaism. It took several more centuries for the monotheistic claim to merge with imperial power in the form of the Christian state religion of the Roman Empire and the expansionist movements of early Islam. The idea that there is only one God of the universe whose reign is represented by the papacy saw one of its most astonishing moves in terms of imperial ideology in 1494, when Pope Alexander VI confirmed the division of the New World, nel nombre de Dios Todopoderoso, as you can see in the first line of the document, between the kingdoms of Portugal and Spain, by a demarcation line along the meridian 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands, the consequences of which are still visible in the borderline between Brazil and the rest of South America. The world has seen numerous instances of imperial claims justified by references to the only God of the universe and claims to his legitimate representation, most recently by the Russian Orthodox Church's ideology adopted by Putin as Russian state ideology. These undoubtedly many and highly problematic references to monotheism for the justification of imperial power and violence should not lead us to overlook that in a moment of its emergence, the monotheistic idea was a critical reaction to imperial theologies and their justifications of power and violence. Monotheistic universalism has also had a long history of reception as a counter-imperial conception to promote the idea of one single humanity ruled by one single God, notwithstanding human claims to power. I tried to show that the transformations of imperial theologies under Nabonidus, Cyrus, and Darius I inspired creative transformations by Judean theologians, which significantly influenced the emergence of monotheism, so that the transformations of imperial theologies from the Neo-Babylonian to the early Persian Empire had longue durée consequences and truly became a moment of world historical significance. Thank you very much for your attention.